Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today I have a very special video for you if you're a fan of Wonders of the First, because Wonders announced their very first changes to the DBS system. For those of you who don't know what the DBS system is, it is essentially a way to gauge the power of a deck in competitive play. So every single card in the game has a point value assigned to it, and then your deck has to come under a certain total point value in order to be legal in competitive play. Right now, it's looking like 1,000 points is the typical bar for legal constructed play, but they do also have a tier that is 1,250 points for extra powerful decks, and then they have a lower tier that's only 750 points that's meant to be lower powered decks that make you have to think a little bit deeper and more cleverly about how to utilize your cards in order to have your deck come in under that 750 point value. But 1,000 is pretty much agreed upon as the competitive point value that most people will be aiming towards. I'm pretty sure that's the point value that they're going to be using on all of their constructed tournaments moving forward. And so this change to the DBS system is essentially increasing and decreasing the point values of certain cards that have proven to be either more powerful or less powerful than anticipated, or maybe for a variety of other reasons that we just don't know yet. We're going to start here by reading the official post about this. It says, official announcement DBS V1 and future update plans. After extensive internal testing during what we call the beta phase, we are proud to officially launch DBS version 1. The dynamic balancing score DBS is our approach to maintaining a healthy and evolving game environment, ensuring that balance remains a top priority while keeping gameplay engaging and competitive. Looking ahead, our next major DBS update will take place in September 2025 as part of our preparations for Set 2, Call of the Stones. This update will be a comprehensive review of the entire card pool with adjustments designed to refine and enhance the overall balance of the game. While larger DBS updates will typically align with new releases, the dynamic nature of this system means that we will continue to monitor the evolving metagame and make adjustments as needed. If we observe developments that require intervention, we will not hesitate to make necessary changes to maintain a fair and exciting competitive landscape. We appreciate the community's feedback and engagement as we continue to refine and improve the game. Stay tuned for further updates, and thank you for being part of this journey. And then they have links there to the change log, which shows the old DBS score, the new DBS score, and shows you the changes. We're actually going to dive into that in just a moment and go over a bunch of those changes. And they also have a link there to a printable DBS that reflects the new DBS scores so that you can just print that out and have access to every single value, every single point value for every single card as they stand after this initial DBS change. But we're going to dive right into the list here and we're going to see what they have changed. So right off the bat, you'll see that I highlighted a bunch of cards beforehand that I think are the most notable increases and decreases to go over. Although every single card on this list is honestly, it's there for a reason, right? And some of the smaller changes, I just want to get this out of the way before we dive in. Some of the smaller changes are probably reflecting things that they noticed in deck building, where maybe a deck is coming just barely under the 1,000 point total, and they want to just bump up that point value just by a few in order to get you to have to now adjust that deck, take out something a little bit more powerful and replace it in order to make that deck function. So if you see a lot of these like negligible little increases or decreases, I really think it's just trying to push and pull certain decks that already exist just slightly to make people have to get inventive and figure out how to adapt to those changes. But the notable increases and decreases, the big value changes, is what I'm interested in the most. First of all, before we dive into those, I do want to point out Aether Valkyr got a change from 0 DBS to 3, and that's just a token. And I think that the reason they changed that token in particular ties into the fact that it was used very prominently in the deck that won first place at the Existence Constructed tournament at the first Shattering launch event. And so we're going to dive into some of these cards in depth and show them on screen after we look at this list, and that's going to be one of them. I also want to point out Deep Pincher got a cost reduction of -24, which is the biggest cost reduction out of any of the cards on this DBS change, and I think that's just because they want to see Deep Pincher see more play. I think it's underutilized and underappreciated in the meta right now. I think they believe it has a chance at being more competitive than it is, and they want to push people to experiment with that card and to try to make it work and to just see how much value you can get out of a card like that when built around properly. So we're seeing a really big cost reduction here to try to make that happen. I'm also seeing Dragon's Gold get the same cost reduction at -24, and I think that's for similar reasons. I think nobody's really seen the full extent to which Dragon's Gold can really go the distance and do the thing that it's trying to do. And I think they're really trying to incentivize people to build decks that incorporate that, so we can really push it to the limit and just see what it can do. The most notable change in the entire list is Ethos Relic FR38, which got a cost bump of 39 points, the highest change, the biggest difference of any card on this list. It went from 31, which was the old DBS score, to 70 here, which is just absolutely bananas. And for good reason. This card just gets you a ton of value, and it combos with some really crazy cards, some other cards on this list, to be honest, but we're going to dive deeper into those individual cards again after we look at the full list. Let's move on. I just want to point out really quickly Knievel Wayfarer. It's not necessarily one of the biggest changes on this list, but it's one of my favorite cards, so seeing it get an 18-point cost reduction makes me super, super happy. I want to build even more decks with Knievel Wayfarer, and it seems like they're really incentivizing me to do that. We've also got Omnis Quantum here seeing an increase of 32 points up to 100. That might be the most expensive card DBS-wise in the entire game. I think there are some cards that have the same DBS value as that. I'm not entirely certain at the moment, but either way, it absolutely deserves to get that huge bump. And again, that's another thing we're going to dive into when I bring the cards up on screen after this. That card is oppressive. And it's getting a 32-point increase because of it. We also see Path of Light getting a 26-point increase from a measly 9 on the DBS to a 35-point DBS value, which is about time. Like, that absolutely needs to happen. That is an insane card for an uncommon, and it's super important with a lot of what the decks are doing in the current meta, at least from what we saw at the first Shattering Existence Constructed tournament. So I'm glad to see that bump up. We also got a cost reduction on the Phoenix Quill, an 18-point reduction, and it brings it down to just 10 points, and that card is insanely powerful. I think this is an example, I don't know for sure, I'm just guessing, trying to get in the developers' heads, but I think this is an example of wanting the developers wanting to push the limit and just see how crazy Phoenix Quill can be, try to incentivize all of us to use it in our decks as much as possible, to just really just push it to its limit and see how crazy it can be, to really be able to effectively judge how powerful it is in the future, and maybe if that point cost should go up in the future. They really just want to see, I think, a lot of gameplay with the Phoenix Quill, and they're incentivizing that with a -18-point reduction down to just 10, which is absolutely nuts because that card is so powerful. We also see Sears Gaze with a huge point increase of 32, and that's another example of a card that's just insanely powerful with the way the current meta is stacking up, and it's just a common. It's probably the most powerful common. I wouldn't say necessarily the best common. I think the Crystal Mouse might be the best common in the set, which we also see up here got a cost increase of 9 DBS points up to 20 from 11. But the Sears Gaze is definitely one of the most powerful commons that is very, very relevant in the current meta, so it makes sense to see a 32-point bump there. And then moving on to the last notable card that I want to discuss, we've got Sirius Aetherblade here getting a 37-point bump from just 3 up to 40. And I know for sure that that is because of the way it was played at the first Shattering launch event during the Existence Constructed tournament, because I actually had Sirius Aetherblade used against me by Sneaky Joe and shut down so much stuff on my side of the board, it was just insane. And the fact that that only cost 3 points in the DBS value to include that in your deck is kind of insane. It should have been a lot higher from the beginning, and I think this card is an example of a card that should have been higher right from the get-go, and the developers are they're realizing it now. The designers and playtesters are realizing just how crazy this card is, and that it absolutely needed to be bumped up. But we're going to move on to discussing the cards in a little bit greater detail by bringing them up on screen. And before we do that really quick, I do just want to mention that another reason for some of these point changes could be that there is a new set coming out, Set 2, in October. And I think the designers of this game are making these DBS changes not only with the results of the first Shattering Existence Constructed tournament in mind, but also knowing what's coming in Set 2. I'm sure they have ideas about how some of those cards are going to interact with cards in the first set, and how some certain archetypes and playstyles are going to get even more powerful when Set 2 drops, knowing what cards are coming in Set 2. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of these point changes might be because of plans that they have for cards that are releasing with Set 2 that are going to make things more powerful or less powerful because of that. And I don't know that for sure, but you could theorize and really just dig into all of these cards and really analyze the heck out of them and try to figure out if maybe certain cards are pointing in that direction. There's a lot you can analyze about these DBS changes, and I think that's super interesting. But for now, let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of those most notable changes. So the first thing I want to talk about right off the bat is the Aether Valkyr token, which is the only token that got a DBS bump. And the one thing I do want to point out about this is I think maybe the reason it got a bump was because it was showcased pretty prominently in the deck that won first place at the Existence Constructed tournament at the first Shattering, and that deck used Cosmic Cataclysm to make them, an 8-cost primary spell which creates a 4-power Angel token wonder with flying in up to 3 different realms, and you gain 2 free attacks. The one thing I want to point out is you can use anything you want to represent a token. You can use a coin or a die. You don't have to actually have the card. It only costs the DBS points if you actually put the card itself into your token deck. And if you look at this spell right here, it makes a 4-power Angel token. It is 4 power, it is Angel, and it does have flying no matter what, even if you just use a coin or a die to represent it. So going back to the token card, the only real difference that the card has over just a normal token, and the reason why it would take 3 points in your DBS in your token deck, is simply just the wonder types that it has, the Viking and Warrior types. So I'm really curious if there are enough synergies out there that synergize with Viking or Warrior, or maybe both, that really justify having that DBS cost for the Aether Valkyr token. And maybe there are things like, you know, Floral Diadem of the Verdant Queen and whatnot that can buff up everything of a certain type. You could use stuff like that with this for, you know, Viking or Warrior to matter. But I'm not really sure how much it matters, at least not yet. And this is the one thing that makes me think maybe they have something in mind from Set 2, from Call of the Stones, that's coming, that's going to make Vikings and or Warriors that much better, and are potentially going to make that deck that won first place at the Existence Constructed tournament that much better because of it. So they're taking the chance now, the opportunity now, to buff up the DBS score on every single token you put into your token deck. That's the actual Aether Valkyr token, 3 points each. Pretty interesting. But next I want to move on to some of the big cost reductions, the first of which here is Deep Pincher, that 4-cost secondary wonder with 3 power. It has Death Strike. On attack, create a 1-power insect token wonder in this realm. And I think they just really want to see this card pushed to its full potential. I don't feel like it's highly represented in competitive play in the meta right now. I don't think a lot of people are using this. I feel like it's overshadowed by the Crow that has flying and death strike and is really cheap because you can move it around all over the place and take advantage of the death strike in multiple realms. And I feel like Deep Pincher is kind of getting overshadowed by that card. So I feel like this card has a ton of potential if used right, and most of that potential has barely been tapped into by the player base right now, and they really want to see us push this card to its limit. Being able to create a 1-power insect token wonder every single time you attack in that realm, you can use those tokens to great effect, whether it's sacrifice fodder or things that buff up, you know, all insects or all tokens or whatever the case may be. There is a lot of ways to get value off of this, and I think a lot of those ways of getting value are underrepresented and underexplored at this point. So it'll be really interesting to see if people start experimenting with Deep Pincher in their decks more. And in a similar fashion, we also saw Dragon's Gold get a metrically huge reduction in DBS point value. A 4-cost primary spell, wonders, or rather primary item, wonders in your hand with cost 6 or more, cost 2 less to play. And I think this is another one that's just very underrepresented across the meta right now and across deck building. And they really want to push this card to its limits and see just how crazy it can be when people really build around it and try to make the most use out of it. Getting that 2 cost reduction on everything that costs 6 or more, in addition to 1 cost reduction if you have the right land in play, is a lot. You could be playing 6 drops for only 3 energy a piece, which allows you to get an insane amount of value onto the board, way more than your opponent, and potentially take over the game. It's just you got to get this item down first, and the item itself is going to cost you energy to get down as well as an action. So you really need to go deep in order to make use of this card. It makes sense that they really want to push the community to try to explore more with a card like this, just like with Deep Pincher. And this is just me guessing. This is me speculating. I don't know if that's the reason why these cards got a cost reduction, but that's just sort of like what I'm thinking on my end, and assuming the case might be. The other card that got a big cost reduction is Phoenix Quill. And if I had to guess, I think this card got a cost reduction or a DBS point reduction for a very different reason. This is a 0-cost legendary item that has a sacrifice-free ability that nets you 3 energy, allows you to play any core cards from any orbital for the rest of the round, and lets you bury all the cards in your hand, putting them on the bottom of your deck and drawing the same number of cards. This card just does everything. Not only can it allow you to play some really insane board presence super early in the game with the extra energy, excuse me, but it also acts as a way to filter out all of the cards in your hand, dig that much deeper into your deck, and try to find your combo pieces in some kind of a combo deck. So this card just does everything you want in a card, and I feel like the reason it's getting a cost reduction to only 10 DBS points is simply to try to push this card to its limits and see just how crazy and how broken it might be. I think they just need everybody and their mom using this card as much as possible so that they have plenty of just cases to see just how nuts the card has the potential to be. They need to get a lot more games under their belt and see a lot more people using this more often so that they can effectively gauge just how powerful this card is. That's my hypothesis. That's my theory as to why this got a big cost reduction, because this card's insanely powerful, and I expect to see this everywhere now at only 10 DBS points, and that's just nuts to me. So we are going to see it everywhere, and we're going to end up seeing just how crazy this card is, and just how much it can contribute to some ridiculous combos out there. I'm pretty excited to just see how nuts this ends up being within the meta. The next card is the first big cost bump that we got, the big cost increase that we've seen in cards, and that's Path of Light, a 3-cost secondary spell. This round, nullify all items and lands, including those that arrive later this round. This card is just absolutely nuts. It gives you so much value by nullifying not only all their items, but more importantly, all of their lands. If their lands become nullified, they no longer can harvest them to gain actions back. And we saw the very tip top of the meta, the most powerful decks out there, utilize cards like this, or utilize a ton of lands so that cards like this are needed. in the Existence Constructed tournament that happened at the first Shattering. In fact, the first place deck, the championship deck from that tournament, was a deck built around lands that had 20 lands in the deck. Almost half the deck was lands, 20 of the 50 cards, which was absolutely insane. And for the most part, he decided to keep those lands untapped as long as possible, saving those actions for later rounds. And a Path of Light is able to completely tank that strategy. And we do see that strategy being used a lot in the meta right now. So a card like Path of Light being able to completely decimate that sort of strategy is very powerful, and it makes sense that it would see a point bump. We've also got Omnis Quantum getting a huge point bump. This card's just nuts. I saw it firsthand at the Existence Constructed tournament in South Carolina. A 6-cost primary wonder with 8 power on Ascend, which will trigger on the final round, round 7. It gets +4, but more importantly, on Ascend you pick odd or even. Opponents can't play cards with that base cost this round, which is absolutely nuts. Even by itself, that is super powerful, and I think that the designers underestimated just how powerful that is. Because even if you don't do any crazy tricks or combos, half the cards on average in your opponent's hand won't be able to be played at all in the final round, which is the most important round of the game, which is already nuts. But what happened to me is you can combo with this and use Lunar Empowerment, which is a spell that makes it ascend again. You can make a couple wonders ascend, and if they've already ascended, you can make them ascend an additional time. So what happens is round 7 starts, Omnis Quantum ascends, you pick odd or even, you knock out half the cards your opponent can play, and then the very first chance you get, the first action, you play Lunar Empowerment, and you just trigger Ascend again, and then you pick whatever you didn't pick last time. So you pick odd, and then you cast Lunar Empowerment, you pick even, and now your opponent literally can't play anything, which is just nuts. And 0 counts as even. So they literally can't play anything, even 0 cost stuff like lands. And it's absolutely game-breaking. It ruined me. Sneaky Joe did this to me in the very first round of the Constructed tournament. And it was absolutely backbreaking. So even outside of that combo, I think this card is really powerful. But with that combo in mind, it's just absolutely insane. And so it makes sense that they increased the DBS score on this. Absolutely. They're basically saying, like, the score is so high here that if you want access to something this powerful or a combo this powerful, you're going to have to give up something really powerful in order to make that happen. You're going to have to give up on some other crazy powerful combo, and you're not going to be able to fit all of those crazy combos or those crazy high power plays in the same deck if you want to use the Omnis Quantum, which is kind of what I like to see. I'm pretty excited about that. We also saw Sears Gaze get a pretty big bump. 2-cost secondary spell, draw a card for each untapped land you control. This card is insane for the opposite reason that Path of Light is insane, because it just draws you like half your deck. It can draw so many cards. Again, I'm going to reference the deck that took first place at the Existence Constructed tournament at the first Shattering. It was a deck based around lands. It had 20 lands of the 50-card deck, and it just basically put out a ton of lands, kept them all untapped as long as possible, used multiple Sears Gaze to just draw a ton of cards, and then combo off in the final round. Not only is that effective for letting you draw a bunch of cards with something like Sears Gaze, but it's also just really good to have a whole bunch of untapped lands going into the final round and just having way more actions than your opponent can possibly keep up with. So Sears Gaze, absolutely nuts, just refills your hand out of nowhere, and that's a strategy that I've seen utilized in a lot of different decks, not just the first place deck from the Existence Constructed tournament. So it makes sense that this card would get a bump as far as the DBS value is concerned. And next we have Entangle. And I didn't really see this one coming, but it makes a lot of sense to me. A 6-cost primary spell. Each player loses all but one of their remaining actions this round. So, a card like this, having this in your hand, makes your opponent worried, or at least if your opponent thinks you might have this in your hand, it makes your opponent super worried if they harvest all of their lands at once and just get a bunch of actions in their action pool. Well, now you play Entangle and they lose them all. So having this card makes your opponent want to harvest one land at a time and not overextend and not get all their actions at once for fear that they might play the Entangle and really mess with you. But at the same time, on the opposite end of the coin, you have Path of Light, which we already saw get a buff, a DBS score buff in this video. And that does kind of the opposite. If you're worried about your opponent having a Path of Light in their hand, you're going to want to tap all your lands, harvest them all for actions as soon as possible before your opponent plays that Path of Light and nullifies all your lands and makes it so that you can't harvest any of them and get the actions back. So the potential to have both Entangle and Path of Light in the same deck and put your opponent into a position where they're kind of screwed if they do, screwed if they don't. If they tap all their lands now, then you get to get hit by an Entangle. If they try to save them all and harvest them once at a time because they're worried about Entangle, then they end up getting hit by a Path of Light. So it's really, really scary, the potential to see both of those cards in the same deck. So I think both of those cards getting a DBS score increase is just their way of trying to make sure that, like, hey, if you're trying to run both of those in the same deck and have an option for either thing that happens to be able to adapt to whatever your opponent's doing, whichever way they try to go with their lands, it's going to cost you, right? It's going to be so expensive to include those high DBS cards, to include both of them, multiple copies of both of them, that you're going to have to reduce the power elsewhere in the deck in order to accommodate it. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because that combo could be kind of nuts, and either one of these spells could be really, really crazy and potentially just win you the game outright against the right deck if you use it at the right time. So yeah, I guess in hindsight, Entangle is a good choice for getting a DBS bump for sure. Next up, we've got Sirius Aetherblade. This is one that needed to have a higher DBS value right from the beginning. It's just super oppressive. It bullies opponents like crazy. It's a 4-cost primary wonder with 4 power, and opponents' items with cost 2 or less and enemies with cost 2 or less are nullified, which is insanely powerful. Some decks are completely built around interesting text boxes and the abilities of things that are low cost. If you play Sirius Aetherblade, it's one card that just shuts them all down. Just boom. This card can just defeat decks like that are hyper reliant on low cost abilities on items and wonders. Just completely shut them down and win you the game. Just take all of their synergies offline. But what's cool about Sirius Aetherblade is on the other side of the coin, it's not ever really useless. Even if a deck isn't built around maximizing synergies with really low cost wonders and items, they're bound to have some wonders and items in their deck. At the very least, at the ground floor, they're going to have some stuff that Sirius Aetherblade turns off. So the ability to have a card in your deck that in certain matchups will just straight up come out of nowhere and nuke the opponent's deck and just win the match for you just by itself, that also isn't useless against other matchups, that at its worst is still going to be a relevant threat at 4 power that shuts off some of your opponent's stuff. Like, that versatility is what makes this card so awesome. Sometimes it's useful and sometimes it wins the game, and that's just bananas. So, increasing the DBS score of Sirius Aetherblade makes all the sense in the world. I am so happy to see it happen, and I think you're still going to see this card everywhere. It's still going to see play in a ton of decks, because it is just that oppressive and that crazy against certain decks. And like I said, still relevant against every deck, even if less so. So you're going to see this pop up a lot still, but at least people that use it are going to have to bring down the power level of their deck overall in order to include it moving forward. And that brings us to our last card to talk about, which is the absolute highest DBS increase of the entire list. And that's Ethos Relic FR38. This is just a 2-cost primary wonder with 2 power, and whenever a card becomes nullified, you draw a card and target player loses 1 energy. So what's so good about this card, similar to Sirius Aetherblade, is in combination with some cards, it's extremely oppressive. It comes out of nowhere and gets you an insane amount of value and takes over the game. But even if you're not comboing with those cards, there are so many situations within the game where it's still going to be useful. If you only have like one thing that you can use to nullify, and so you draw a card and they lose 1 energy, it's still probably worth playing if that happens consistently, because drawing that card would normally cost you an action. So now getting to draw a card for free is basically saving you an action, and in a way that almost feels like getting your action back that it uses to play, that you have to use to play the Ethos Relic to begin with. Except also in the process you have a 2-power wonder, and you make them lose an energy, which could be a little detrimental, a little bit of silver lining value. So even if you have just some auxiliary supplemental ways of nullifying things in your deck, Ethos Relic could still be pretty good, just played fairly. But then, on the other side of the coin, what makes it so nuts is that it combos with things that are going to nullify a whole bunch of stuff at once. Sirius Aetherblade being one of those examples. If you already have Ethos Relic down, and then all of a sudden you play a Sirius Aetherblade, and you nullify like 7 wonders or items on the opponent's side that cost 2 or less, it's going to trigger that Ethos Relic 7 times. You're going to draw a whole new hand of cards, and your opponent's going to basically lose all of their energy. They're going to lose 7 energy all in one fell swoop, which is backbreaking. Like, if you do that at the right time, especially if it's early in a round before your opponent really gets to use any of their energy to play the things they want to play, you just take over the game. Like, you put them so far behind, they can't come back. And in similar fashion, there's an even better card you can combo Ethos Relic with, which is Path of Light, which we already talked about in this video. It comes down, nullifies all items and lands, including those that arrive later this round. It even nullifies your own lands, which if you have Ethos Relic out, you can actually use to your own benefit. You're going to draw like 15 cards, nullifying all their stuff, nullifying your stuff, make them lose all of their energy. The fact that there are multiple cards in the game that allow you to trigger an Ethos Relic to an insane degree by just playing one card is nuts. There's too many ways for this card to combo off and just take over the game. And then just like Sirius Aetherblade, even at its worst, as long as it's in a deck that's building around it properly, you're still going to get some value off of it, enough value to justify including it in your deck. So that sort of ceiling being so high of the potential of what it could do, but also the floor being pretty high in that even at its worst, it's typically still going to get you some value that's worth having, just makes it absolutely nuts. So I'm really glad that they increased the cost of the Ethos Relic FR38. The card is absolutely bonkers. Ethos Relic and Sirius were the 2 cards that I thought needed it the most before we found out what the DBS changes were going to be, and it feels really, really good to be right about that and see both of those cards get the biggest increases across the board, because those cards are nuts, and this game is nuts, and I love it, and I'm really excited about these DBS changes, and I'm super excited to see what the community does moving forward and how this affects deck building. I've already got a bunch of decks. I want to dive back into cardio, into my decks, and just see how these changes are implemented and what sort of changes it makes to my decks, which decks become illegal because of it, and how I need to adapt them, and that sort of thing. These will go live on Cardio in the deck builder and the card database on Friday, May 30th. That's tomorrow at the time of filming this, so you'll be able to jump into the editor and check everything out for yourself. But if you can't wait until then, like I said before, I have links down below to the full change log of all the changes if you want to check them out at your own leisure, and also a link to the full downloadable lists that have all of the new DBS scores, so that you just have a list available to you that has everything. You could print it out and have it physically if you're more of a physical kind of person. But like I said, you can jump over to Cardio and check that stuff out as early as tomorrow, Friday, May 30th. And I'm really excited to see how the community reacts to this. Definitely let me know in the comments how you're feeling, what you think about this. And it'll be exciting to see where decks go from here. But I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck techs, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.